I thought this was an excellent and fascinating article. It's in Al Jazeera by a Japanese professor, professor of human rights and peace studies in Osaka Jogaquin University. Definitely don't know how to speak Japanese, so don't ask me. Okay, so he begins by saying, no matter how it concludes, South Africa's lawsuit in the International Court of Justice arguing Israel has violated the Genocide Convention will go down in history. It will either be remembered as the first step towards finally holding a rogue state accountable for repeated long-standing violations of international law, or as the last dying breath of a dysfunctional Western-led international system. And that's really interesting because it's basically like no matter which side the ICJ sides on, which way they go, it seems likely they will let Israel off the hook because they are, manipulated by the U.S. and Israel and Britain, etc. But either way, it'll have a major impact. If it were to find Israel's committing genocide, that's a major impact. If it were to find Israel's not committing genocide when everyone knows they are, then that delegitimizes the entirety of the Western. And when we say Western-led, really, we mean U.S.-led, because the U.S. Is the main driver of most of this. The EU and Britain and everything are almost akin to vassal states now. So it would be the end of the Western-led international system. He continues, for the hypocrisy of Western governments and the Western political elite as a whole has finally brought the so-called rules-based world order, which the U.S. continues to tout, which basically means whatever rules the U.S. makes and they only apply to other people the U.S. doesn't like, they don't apply to the U.S. at all. Rules-based world order they purport to lead to the point of no return. Full-throttled Western support for Israel's genocidal rampage in Gaza has truly exposed the double standards of the West with regard to human rights and international law. There is no turning back, and the West has only its own arrogance to blame. Regardless of the oppression perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinian people, tens of thousands of people are coming out on the streets day after day expressing their disgust at Israeli atrocities and Western complicity. Desperate to regain some semblance of credibility, Western governments, including the U.S., have recently started to be marginally critical of Israeli attacks. However, it is too little, too late. Western credibility has been shredded irrevocably. Of course, Western hypocrisy is nothing new. So, yes, I'm sure many of you are immediately saying, like, the West lost their credibility years ago. I mean, they've killed 6 million in the global war on terror. They invaded Iraq on false pretenses and murdered hundreds of thousands. So they lost their credibility long ago. But it is different now. There is a difference now. Part of it is the sheer speed and horror of Israel's genocide right now. This is not years. This is 3 months, and they've killed 23,000 people, almost entirely innocent civilians. This is attacking of hospitals and journalists, killing more UN workers than any conflict ever, killing more journalists than any conflict ever. All of this is happening at a speed that is unprecedented, and a level of non-concern for the victims that is unprecedented in many ways. In terms of non-concern of the victims, obviously it is there are other genocides where it is precedented, but the speed at which they're killing is very rare. But it's also unprecedented in how little world support there is for this. 80% of all human beings on this planet live in countries that are not at all supporting Israel's genocide. Of the remaining 20%, you have many of those don't support Israel's genocide. At least the people don't, even if the elected lunatics do. And so it's different in that regard, but perhaps the biggest way it's different is that this is all being live streamed to us. We haven't had a genocide at this level live streamed to the world before, at least not in a way that everyone's able to go and see it. And because, yeah, internet has existed since whenever you want to say 80s, 90s, early 90s, but it wasn't fast and available in everyone's homes and available on everyone's phones until, you know, 2006, 2008, and then to get to other countries as well as Western countries, you're talking 2012. And so it's really just in recent years that everyone's been able to just look on their phone and see this genocide and see a genocide. So it really is different in that way. And it's destroying the credibility of the United States and the Western-led hegemonic order. International justice has become a sick joke. Were the International Criminal Court functioning effectively, Israeli leaders would be on trial even as we speak, and there would have been no need for South Africa to approach the ICJ. As it stands, though, the ICC only indicted Africans until 2022. The International Criminal Court has almost exclusively indicted Africans. I think there might have been one white guy, maybe Milosevic, but almost entirely Africans, because apparently only Africans can commit war crimes. Until 2022, when it announced an investigation into the Russian invasion of Ukraine less than a week after it started. So you see, the ICC is a politicized arm of Western hegemony, even though the U.S. won't sign on to it. From the get-go, international legal norms were intended to apply only to so-called civilized, basically white peoples. He's talking about Western hypocrisy in terms of international law. From the get, I don't want to reread that. From the get-go, international legal norms were intended to only apply to so-called civilized, as in white peoples. Savages did not count. He's, of course, being sarcastic. And the powerful Western states could and did do to them what they pleased. Natives certainly did not own land. A native can't own land, right? Only white people can own land. Natives certainly did not own land or natural resources, and colonial powers were free to steal and exploit those as they wished. Zionism was also founded on such racist attitudes that remain at the core of Israeli policies to this day. The UN General Assembly has stated repeatedly that armed struggle, including that of the Palestinian people, against colonial rule is legitimate. Remember that when you're getting in debates with people about Israel's genocide. The UN has repeatedly ruled that armed struggle against colonial rule is legitimate. And the 1977 additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions on the Laws of War also stated that struggles against colonial and racist regimes are valid. International law has definitely developed in the right direction. Still, the systems to implement international law remain weak. Yes, they do. Incredibly weak. Even if this ICJ issues a provisional order against, for Israel to halt its violence, and even if years later it finds Israel guilty of genocide without any enforcement, Israel can and probably will simply ignore those decisions. That would surely be the end of the current world order, as any facade of fairness would collapse. Enforcement of international law is in the hands of the UN Security Council, but with its veto rights for the 5 countries that happened to be on the winning side in 1945, that body has time and again proven itself incapable of fulfilling its mandate. The General Assembly lacks any enforcement power. But it is interesting that if the ICJ says Israel must halt its genocide and Israel just ignores it, then that's the end of the ICJ. I mean, it shows itself to be utterly meaningless, which is what he's talking about when he says this very well could be, Gaza could be the grave of the Western-led world order. It proves both the weakness and the hypocrisy of the Western-led world order. So in that way, we're in for a global shift that many people are not talking about. Many people are acting like this horrific genocide begins and ends in Gaza and the surrounding areas. But in fact, these are global ramifications, even without it breaking into a regional war, which it very much seems it is headed in that direction.